My pleasure to introduce the first of our keynote speakers at this conference, Sheldon Garon. Really glad to have you here. Sheldon Garon is the Nissen Professor of History and East Asian Studies at Princeton University, where he has taught for 31 years. A specialist in modern Japanese history, he also writes transnational history that spotlights the flow of ideas and institutions among the US, Japan, and European and Asian countries. His recent book, which I found fascinating, entitled Beyond Our Means, Why America Spends While the World Saves, examines what Americans might learn from European and East Asian nations whose public policies have vigorously encouraged citizens to save over the past 2 centuries. The book has received media attention from NPR, BBC, New York Times, The Guardian, Financial Times Deutschland, Asahi Shimbun, The Australian, and SCORAI, and other newspapers and magazines around the world. He has spoken at events hosted by Federal Reserve Bank, also St. Louis and Minneapolis Feds, JP Morgan Chase, New America Foundation, Institute for American Values, European Savings Banks Group, Center for Financial Studies in Germany, and Child and Youth Finance International in Amsterdam. In my personal conversation with Professor Garon, he told me that one group that doesn't invite him very often to speak are mainstream economists. Professor Garon's previous publications include The State and Labor in Modern Japan, Molding Japanese Minds, The State and Labor in Modern Japan, Molding Japanese Minds, The State of Everyday Life, and The Ambivalent Consumer, Questioning Consumption in East Asia and the West. Very appropriate as we are talking here about consumer societies in the US and other rich parts of the world and the emerging consumer societies in Asia. So welcome, Sheldon Garon.
Thank you very much, Helena, for that kind introduction, and thank you also to the organizers. This is the first conference I've ever been at in my life that's actually running ahead of schedule, which is really cool, and I will try and be as brief as I can in my remarks. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about my recent book, Beyond Our Means. And I should shamelessly add that the book has just come out in paperback, just in time for course adoption. There are some flyers, I believe, in the back of the room, and I think some books are being brought over from your bookstore, and they should suddenly materialize by the end of the talk. Well, I must confess that when I first began doing the research for this book, saving money was not exactly a sexy topic. Certainly not in the United States, where policymakers have long fixated on promoting consumer spending as the engine of economic growth, as you just heard. But In the wake of the 2008 financial and housing meltdown, in some ways the issue of saving has become maybe not sexy, but maybe a little bit too exciting for a lot of Americans. Because we have in this country millions and millions of American households who lack the minimal saving to deal with life's basic emergencies, with the loss of a job, with home foreclosure, with medical emergencies, not to mention the prospect of very uncomfortable retirements with inadequate saving. To quantify this, there have been various surveys that show that somewhere between about 44% and 50% of American households have little or no liquid saving that they could fall upon in the event of an emergency. Still, Americans find the issue of saving to be rather uncomfortable to talk about, especially at Christmas time, as I found out. My book came out a couple of Decembers ago, and for my sins, I was invited onto a lot of radio interviews and other interviews that all focused not on saving, but on the topic of Christmas shopping. And I found that the interviewers would become increasingly hostile in their questions to me, and finally they would simply blurt out, "But if Americans started saving again, wouldn't that single-handedly destroy the American economy?" And I had no idea that simply talking about saving would make me in this country the enemy of the people, or even worse, the Grinch. So this book is in part a history of how Americans came to so privilege consumer spending over saving, but it also tells another story about how people in many other nations, East and West, learned how to save, and also, and this is relevant to this conference, learned how to strike some balance, or at least recognize there must be a balance between saving and consumption. Now, it's well known that the area of the world I most study, East Asia, has countries that have historically been known as very thrifty, and certainly starting with my object of study, Japan. Japan has long had very high savings rates going back decades and decades. They were joined by other East Asians, Koreans, Singaporeans, and then of course finally China itself, which may have a savings rate today, nobody's quite sure, of perhaps 26% of household disposable income. Well, when the American media and even when our economists talk about East Asian thriftiness, they usually explain it in terms of some sort of distinctive culture that people seem to have in East Asia, whether it's Confucianism or Buddhism or even something called Asian values. The problem with that analysis, simply looking at cultural specificity in East Asia, is it doesn't account for what you see on this chart. It's simply some of the major countries in the world and their net household savings rate. And it tells a story that very few people in America, including our people in our economics departments, whom you've heard don't usually give me the time of day, so I feel I can talk about them because they won't be here anyway. But anyway, that if you look at the chart, what you notice is that some of the major economies, in fact, several of the major economies of continental Europe, also have long histories and recent histories of high savings. So, France, Germany, I could have put Austria, I could have put Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden, actually kind of a surprise, but a lot of the core economies of continental Europe have long had high household savings rates, and they continue to do so over the last 30 years, and they certainly started long before 30 years. Ironically, some of the leading savers of East Asia, Japan, and I could have put South Korea there as well, have actually seen their savings rates come from very high levels, like let's say 23%, down to levels that are even below the United States. So we have this puzzle. If it's just East Asian culture, how come the continental Europeans also manifest this certain quite distinctive approach to both saving and spending, since they're obviously related? And of course, what comes out in a chart like this is how exceptional the United States and maybe a few other English-speaking countries are, and that much of the world indeed, at least a lot of the core economies, continue to save. Well, how do we explain this? Well, as I said, economists who were supposed to be the people who monopolize the discussion of saving don't have particularly useful explanations of why both Europeans and East Asians should save. If you take any courses on saving or other types of economics in the American Economics Department, the first thing you learn is that strong welfare provision, national pensions and other generous welfare benefits, will, according to the model, disincentivize people from saving. If you think you're going to get benefits and you're going to have an easy retirement, why would you save? Well, the last time I looked, places like France, Germany, maybe even Sweden, have pretty strong welfare states, and yet they save a lot. The United States, with much weaker safety nets, saves very little. So that model isn't particularly useful. And one could talk about other variables that economists have brought up also that don't work very well, like rapidly aging societies are supposed to diminish saving. But again, the Europeans have seen very low birth rates, and rapidly aging societies, it doesn't seem to have done much to take the savings rates down. Well, to a historian like myself, there are other factors I look at, and Helena just hinted at them. One of the factors that brings together these high-saving societies in Europe and East Asia is all of them have long-established histories of institutionally promoting saving. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. They do it by institutions, they do it by sometimes moral suasion campaigns, and they promote what we used to call in this country small savings, something that really doesn't even exist as a concept anymore. In Europe and in East Asia, there's been this long historical commitment to promoting saving among ordinary people. So when we talk about small saving, we're talking about ordinary people saving in banks and post offices, etc. We're not talking about large-scale investors. So that's one thing they have in common, and also not only institutionally promoting saving, but also in most of these societies with high savings, they've also historically and up to the present been much less generous than the United States or the UK in providing forms of credit to their people. So it's two things, promoting saving, but also restraining the explosion of housing and consumer credit, things I'll talk about in a few minutes. Well, I'll spare you the details in the book, which I now magically see has materialized back there. So you can see it's a big, thick book, and there are a lot of chapters, but I'm going to cut through it. And I'm going to sum up some of the ways in which Europeans and Japanese have created institutions that promoted small saving and also, to some extent, restrained consumption. And then we'll consider the ways in which the United States has diverged from saving and consumption practices seen elsewhere. So I'm going to just very quickly run through, if I can, let's see, master this. Some of the institutions that have promoted saving and to some extent restrained consumption in Europe and East Asia. And these go back, as Helena said, about 200 years ago. The first ones start around 1800. They spread rapidly. They were called savings banks. In many, many countries in Europe, they started up soon after 1800. They were an answer to the question of what to do about the working poor, how to give them some sort of planning and order in their lives. I mean, there was somewhat of a conservative impetus behind this to make the poor orderly. But to set up savings banks that were set up by philanthropists, civic organizations, were designed to be not-for-profit and were designed to encourage the working poor to put their meager savings on a regular basis into a savings bank and actually get interest that they could see. And it was interesting. They didn't have economists then, at least not much, but they somehow came up with a model that about 2.5% to 3% in interest would be visible enough and encouraging enough to working poor, young people, and others to save. So savings banks was one of the ways this was done, and it was done very transnationally. This idea spread all over, not and beyond Europe. You're going to see it spread to some extent to North America, Australia, New Zealand, etc. in the 19th century. A second institution, similar to savings banks, but directly managed by central states, was the Postal Savings Bank. If you're an American, I have to introduce this as a new concept. If you live anywhere else in the world, you know what a postal savings bank is. They tend to be in most first world countries and also in a lot of developing countries in the world. They're run by central governments. They're run out of the post office. They, like the savings banks, even more than the savings banks, they take very small savings. They pay these recognizable rates of interest. They have an advantage over private banks in that they are guaranteed by the state. The national treasury stands behind them. So in the 19th century, this is a very powerful way to encourage people to save in banks and institutions, because there was a problem of trust. You had to be able to trust that your savings were going to come back. When postal savings came in the mid-19th century, first with Britain in 1861, it very quickly solved this question of trust and enrolled millions and millions of people. Well, together with the savings banks, the postal savings banks, this is a big revolution of the 19th century. You achieved what today we might call financial inclusion. You got millions and millions of ordinary people, fairly poor people, to begin regularly saving money in institutions. Now, another institution, we don't think of it as a financial institution, but also very powerful in promoting saving and to some extent restraining consumption, was something called the School Savings Bank. These various thrift programs in schools, they start around the same period as the postal savings banks in places like Belgium and France, 1860s, 1870s. They move over to Japan very quickly in the 1890s. Like the post office savings bank, they used the new governmental promoted mass education, compulsory education, to reach millions and millions of school children. The idea was to inculcate habits of saving, of thrift, economy while children were young, as a way of molding adults. And you can see it's very transnational. You see the last picture on your bottom right, it's Singapore, but so everywhere from Europe to Japan to Singapore, very powerful in terms of promoting saving. Now, when we get to the 20th century, this becomes a little more recognizable to those of us who are Americans. You also have war savings programs. And this is interesting because there are a lot of, just like consumption has many meanings, savings has many meanings. You might save for yourself, you might save for your family, but when you have World War II and World War I and II with massive needs for popular finance to finance these huge total wars, you have to go beyond taxation, and this is when you get war bond drives and drives again through a number of these established savings institutions. The meaning of saving now gets a new meaning, not just for yourself, not just for social stability, but for the very survival of your nation in warfare. And you can see very transnational. You get the same exact poster in Britain and in America, both using Joan of Arc. Works a little bit in America where we actually like Joan of Arc, unlike the English who actually detest Joan of Arc because they burned her at the stake. Not very good propaganda on the British side, but it shows how these ideas travel. When we get to World War II, we have more and more elaborate savings programs. In our own country, you're going to see in a few minutes, but certainly all over the world, Japan, Britain, whatever side people were on the conflict, they had the same need, the challenge of raising money. What's interesting, and this was true of World War I too, but what these posters show is it's not just about promoting saving, but for the war effort, you're also encouraging people to diminish their consumption, to eliminate the waste in their life. This is what the Japanese poster is about, or the British poster, and this is actually one of the most popular posters in wartime Britain, the squander bug. So the squander bug was, you can see, alias Hitler's pal. It made you an enemy of the people to actually go shopping. It was sort of like George W. Bush, flipped on his head, that Going shopping made you the enemy of the people, aka Hitler's pal. They talked about the shopper's disease. So you're trying to discourage people from shopping, from wasteful consumption, and instead use that money to save and also funnel some of those materials to the war effort itself. Well, the war ends, not World War II, ends in 1945, and there's another institution and practice that we Americans don't think a lot about, but these are the post-war national savings and austerity campaigns that we see from Europe to Japan, in all the places that have been devastated by World War II. The message in the early post-war period is the only way for places like Germany and Britain and France, you can see France and Italy here, and Japan, the only way they're going to recover is not by promoting consumption, that's a very American idea, but by actually promoting more saving, by discouraging more consumption and using that saving to finance reconstruction. Let me just go back to the British poster, the Keep On Savings campaigns. The one on the right is interesting because it has a blueprint. It may be hard to read for you, but it's about saving not only to finish the war off and defeat the Japanese, but also for Britain's post-war recovery and the beginnings of its welfare state. So it talks about education and housing and health, all these things that are in the Beveridge Plan during World War II. The architecture of the post-war welfare state, and you see this not only in Britain but all over Europe. How's it going to be financed? Again, taxation is one part of it, but saving, using the people's savings to buy bonds and to finance the welfare state. So here, saving again has this very social meaning. It has a meaning of solidarity, the way for these countries to come back. Finance their reconstruction, but also finance the new welfare state is not by consumption, but by saving. And this message particularly is aggressively promoted in post-war Japan. The European national savings and austerity campaigns last roughly about 10 years after World War II. But in Japan, these post-war savings campaigns continue for a long time, actually decades and decades, and don't really stop until sometime in the 1990s. And again, the sort of message that this is actually of the housewife who is seen as the kind of the consumer-in-chief within the household and also the saver. And she's talking about she has to, what it says in Japanese, I've got to plan my finances, got to keep very careful accounts so I balance my consumption and my saving. Now, in Europe, going back to Europe, you don't see these really pronounced savings campaigns after about 1960, but you do see a continued institutional promotion of small saving. And this is from France, where they have a specially designed, government-sponsored passbook for very small savers. It's called the Livret A. It's been there for almost 200 years. It's available at post offices, savings banks, now actually at all banks. And it's interest exempt, the tax exemption on the interest, very low minimum deposit, no fees. It's like the opposite of predatory finance in our own country, and it promotes very high levels of financial inclusion. Only about 1% of French households are actually unbanked, whereas it's very high in our own country. And in Germany, they've solved this problem by having lots of local savings banks and various cooperative banks that are very accessible, have contractual saving with employers, have special youth accounts, work with schools. Now, one other thing I should say about savings campaigns in this post-war period that in a sense leads right up to today is that around the 1970s yet another meaning became attached to saving, and that was an ecological, an environmental one. And this one might surprise you a bit. If you look at various environmental movements really starting up in Europe in the 1970s, they didn't make a very strong association between environmental conservation and thrift or saving. Thrift would have been seen as rather old-fashioned if you were an environmental activist in Germany, let's say, West Germany in the 1970s or 80s. Nonetheless, their messages, their emphasis on on conservation and their powerful critique of excessive consumption in a sense tended to reinforce messages to save, to conserve. In the Japanese case, the link between saving and environmental concerns is much more explicit. And from the 1970s, when Japan also saw the rise of very potent environmental movements, interestingly enough, most of the environmental groups and also consumer activist groups cooperated very closely with the government's campaigns to promote saving. In a sense, they influenced each other. So government promotion of saving in Japan, which, as I said, went on until very recently, acquired a very pronounced environmental element as well. So school children and school savings programs in Japan are taught about how this is good for the environment, that it's involved in curbing the wasteful consumption of resources and commodities. So there have been many meanings, in other words, in Europe and in East Asia attached to the act of saving, one that has lots of relevance to consumption. Well, the question is, bringing this back to the United States, how does the United States fit into this 200-year long history of savings promotion and some restraint on consumption? And the answer, as you'd probably expect, is the U.S. doesn't fit very comfortably at all into this story. If we started with first the savings side, and then we'll talk about consumption in a minute, in terms of saving, in U.S. history, the institutions designed to promote small saving have either been non-existent or relatively weak compared to Europe and East Asia. If you start with the savings banks, which were like the big revolution in the early 19th century, some of them come to the US, and in fact, if you grew up in New England, you would have seen a lot of savings banks until about the 1980s when they got deregulated and they more or less disappeared. In upper Midwest, you'd see a little bit Pacific Coast, but generally savings banks never extended themselves to the great reaches of the United States. And as late as 100 years ago, just in 1910, if you were in a southern or western state, there were almost no places for you to put your small savings. There were almost no small saver-friendly institutions. What about postal savings? That would have been, one would have thought, a no-brainer for the United States. Post offices were everywhere. They were in the South. They were in the West. They were in rural areas. It would have been a very easy way of accomplishing financial inclusion. However, it has a rather sad, pathetic story in the United States. In the 1870s, there were some officials in Washington, in the Postmaster General's office, who pushed for the passage of a postal savings system in the United States, just like in Japan and in Europe. They pushed for it for 40 years. It was resisted throughout this period from the 1870s all the way to 1910 by the commercial banks, which didn't want the competition from a post office savings bank, by regional interests who didn't want money pouring into Washington, D.C. Finally, a tepid postal savings system was passed in 1910 because there had been a major financial panic in 1907 and a lot of banks had failed. So there was some sentiment for it. This very weak version, it was a real compromise. It was shredded by the commercial banking industry. It was put into effect. It accomplished some things for a time in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. It was popular with immigrants. It was popular with some farm communities, but it never really got very far. It was crippled. It couldn't offer interest nearly as high as the banks and others. It was relatively inaccessible. It was not put in every post office. And finally, in 1966, it was abolished by Congress. It had become such a non-event by that point that when they abolished it, most Americans didn't even know it existed to be abolished. It was not very popular. So postal savings, federal intervention didn't succeed very much in that respect. What about the schools? The United States did have some school savings banks. This is from my home state of Minnesota, where you might expect a little bit Northern European, fairly active school savings in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other places. It was also good school savings in a few other pockets in New York City, in actually some of the California cities, but generally very uneven, did not spread to most of the country. Obviously, we don't have a Ministry of Education that could centralize it. Schools are very decentralized. So this is sort of a Garrison Keillor movement, you know, that in Minnesota all the children were above average, so were their school savings banks, and if you do the math, that must mean everybody else was below average, and they were. I did show this photo in Heidelberg, Germany a year ago, and my German audience was stunned, and somebody put their hand up and said, well, how did they get Americans to line up so orderly? And I said, that's easy. They're all Swedish and German immigrants. It's Minnesota. But anyway, so again, this is a problem, real unevenness. Now, there is one moment in which the United States seems to join the rest of the world, and that is in World War II and right after World War II, but especially in World War II, and it's when the needs of the total war effort in the United States meant that the federal government was going to very decisively intervene in the promotion of saving and also the discouragement of consumption. So during the war, as you know, I think we all know, that's the one Americans do know about saving, is their big war bonds drives. During the war bond itself was a rather new thing. It was a savings bond designed for small savers. You bought it at about $17. It matured to $25. It was a very elegant and simple instrument. It was kind of like our answer to postal savings. It was available everywhere. You could get them in your schools with stamps and things like that. You could get them in banks. You could get them in post offices. You could even get them from the local neighborhood woman who went around from door to door. So it was a very accessible, government-guaranteed small savers instrument, highly effective in terms of financial inclusion. And one other thing the U.S. government did that actually started right before World War II, but that was FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. In other words, guaranteeing people's small deposits in banks, which had been a big problem in the United States with so many bank failures. This too made savings, banks, savings and loans and other things much more accessible to the American public. So the high point of U.S. thrift, as it were, of saving, is not in Benjamin Franklin's time, whatever one might think. It's actually this period of World War II and the decade or two after World War II. Well, we then move to what happened after that. After 1945, Americans were, for a time, as I said, fairly good savers, but then during the last 30 years or so, something snaps, and you can see this very graphically in the chart here. Americans were, I mean, we tend to think that Americans have never saved. It's true, they've never saved that much compared to Japanese and Europeans, but they've saved at pretty high levels, at least vis-a-vis themselves. And for much of the post-war period, from 1945 to really the beginning of the 1990s, Americans averaged household savings rates, that's a percentage of disposable income, of somewhere between 7 and 11%. As recently as 1981, it was about 11%. Those are pretty high levels of saving, particularly for Americans. But then you can see the savings rate and savings behavior just falls off a cliff in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Something snaps. How do we explain it? Well, I've decided, in the book, I talk about long-term factors in the decline of American saving and short-term. Let's start with the long-term. And we really start with this very interesting post-war moment, 1945, where the United States looked like no other major economy, if for no other reason than the United States actually had a major economy in 1945. Everybody else, all the advanced economies, were in shambles. I mean, you think of Japan, 66 cities bombed, firebombed, atomic bomb. Germany, most of its major cities and even medium-sized cities and towns bombed. Britain, London, badly bombed. All of them very much in debt from all of the expenses they'd racked up during the war. It didn't matter whether you won or lost. The British were almost in as bad shape as those who lost the war. The United States, by contrast, was in a remarkable economic position in 1945. No war damage. The standard of living had actually risen during World War II. The factories, which had not been bombed, were humming. They very quickly shifted from wartime production back to consumer production. People had lots of cash in their pockets from the wages, from coming back from the war. It was a period when, in a sense, it's actually sort of normal, one might say, that the US did not act like the Europeans and the Japanese. They didn't really have need for austerity movements, savings campaigns, the way that Europeans and Japanese did. And one finds that that consumption then became, as we well know, promoted as really a central part of American governance, both politically but also economically, as the engine of economic growth. And in a sense, this fixation on consumption as both a political and economic panacea, it didn't even wait for the end of World War II to start. And one can see, even during the war, Americans were already talking in quite vivid terms about how much they were going to be able to consume once they won the war. And it's a real contrast, again, to the rest of the advanced economies. And I want to show you what's happening in the rest of the world that's fighting the war. This is from wartime Britain, but it could have been from Germany, it could have been from Japan. In all cases, people were asked in these countries to make huge sacrifices during the war, but then they were kind of thrown this banana that if they saved and they saved and they saved, well, when the war was finally over, they'd be able to build a house or buy something with it. And in England, you can see this poster for war savings. It shows a woman, a war worker, and she's dreaming about what she can do with her war saving. And the dream is pretty modest. She can have a little garden. She can have a husband. She gets a hand-powered lawnmower. That's about it. What were Americans dreaming about at the same year, 1943? Well, they were dreaming in Technicolor. They had big, big dreams. This is a school savings newsletter from 1943. It's talking about what happens 10 years later in 1953 when your war bond matures. So this is the world of 1953 dreaming ahead. Well, in the left-hand corner, you can have television sets, telephone answering machines. In the right-hand corner, you can vacation in Madagascar and all sorts of places. Let's see, Alaska, Hawaii, Venezuela. You can weekend in Mexico City and Newfoundland. But here's my favorite. Right in the center, you can buy your own private air car and soar over the traffic and those poor people that don't have the private air car. This is what people were thinking about. And you know, sometimes Europeans, Japanese, and others I know, you know, they always ask me, you know, Americans have so much stuff. They have such rich consumer lives. Why do they always seem to be angry and frustrated? Well, I don't know about you, but I never got my private air car. Well, anyway, and of course, the private air car didn't happen, but most of the rest of it did. And in fact, in small print, it says, your war bond and your war stamps and payment after the war for post-war consumption. So not just that you were saving up to buy in total, but it'll be the down payment for buying things on the installment plan. So we have a very different trajectory. Another thing that's different in the long term, consumer credit. Americans really pioneer consumer credit. By the 1920s, the installment buying is very big in America. There's a lot more cultural resistance to it in Europe and in Japan. And in the 1950s, installment buying becomes very major. So you've got the infusion of credit like nobody else had. And a final ingredient in the long term is housing, which I don't know how much you're going to talk about at this conference, but housing is so linked to consumption and saving. It took me a long time to figure that out, but it really is the story in the United States. The United States also, unlike almost everyone else, moved decisively by the 1930s and New Deal programs, but especially after World War II, into the federal government's promotion of housing, really a democratization of housing and a democratization of housing credit, with the FHA, with the federal government standing by, ensuring basically banks to make loans. They could be loaned at much lower interest. This is when the 25 to 30-year amortized mortgage came in. It did not really exist much before that. It suddenly made home buying available to people, and the idea was that a lot of your assets would be invested not in banks and in post offices, but in your house. That saving through housing became very major. Now, what also came out of this was suburbanization, as I'm sure everybody knows here. And suburbanization has a real relationship, obviously, to consumption, but also to saving. Because as houses were built further out, this obviously stoked consumption. You needed more energy, you needed gasoline for cars, but also houses got bigger. And I'm sure there's somebody in the room who studies this, but somebody suggested to me once, why don't you look at comparisons of housing size in the rest of the world, compare it to the United States, and it's a very interesting story in terms of saving and consumption. In 1950, when GIs came back from the war, these little two-bedroom houses of the type I just showed you, the average floor space in a new American home in 1950 was just 983 square feet. I used to be able to convert that into square meters. I can't. So if anybody wants to do it, they can. But I did convert everything into square feet. What has happened since? Well, the United States is an amazing story. Houses got bigger and bigger and bigger, stoked in part by the amazing availability of housing credit. In 2004, the average floor space of a new house in America was more than 2,300 square feet. At one point, I think it went up to about 2,500 square feet right before the 2008 meltdown. How does the US compare with everybody else? They're just in a different league. Now, you could throw in Canadians, Australians, they have large houses too, but if you look at Europe, if you look at Japan, you can see very small square footage of new homes built in those countries. Germany, France, more or less 1/2 the level. Italy, even more crowded than Japan. So what happens when you have really small houses compared to really large houses? Well, this is a conference that can do that very quickly. It means a lot more consumption with largeness. It means energy, heating, cooling, and it means more stuff. You've got to put more stuff in all those rooms, and you have more room to put stuff, in a sense. So I think housing size has a lot to do with both larger housing generally means lower savings rates and much higher levels of consumption. Well, let me move on to really the last part of the story. What's happened in the last 30 years? Up to the 1980s, you might say that, okay, this explosion of housing in America, environmentally problematic, financially it seems sustainable. That Americans in the 1950s, 60s, 70s managed to borrow to buy houses, managed to pay back their mortgages, took installment loans to buy cars and refrigerators, managed to pay them back, managed to save at the same time, as you've seen with those savings rates. So financially, the whole thing seemed pretty sustainable. Then things started happening in the 1980s that just made America come unstuck in terms of financial stability. And I'll run through them very quickly. One was the credit card revolution. Credit cards were regulated until a Supreme Court decision in 1978 didn't really kick in until the early 1980s. It used to be that a credit card couldn't charge you more than the state usury rates in each state, which might be 12% or 13%, depending on the state. There was a lid on what they could charge you on what you didn't pay back at the end of the month. That was totally deregulated because this Supreme Court decision from the 1980s, as long as you were willing to set up in a place like South Dakota, which legislature got bought off so that there was no more usury law, you now could charge any rate of interest on the unpaid balance on a credit card. This made credit cards very profitable and also made predatory behavior on the part of the card companies very profitable. Because what you wanted to get was marginal customers who were called, before the mortgage crisis, the original subprime designation was for credit card holders who were fairly poor, probably under great duress, could pay back much of it, and you could make huge amount of money on late fees and on the interest charges. So this made credit cards very profitable, very predatory, very aggressive. This is a period when, you know, you start to get 5 credit card solicitations a day in your mail, even some for your cat, as some people have told me, with their cat's name on them. So that's one thing. The home equity loan. Now this is something that nobody talks about in this country, and I'm not quite sure why. The home equity loan is something that also, like the credit card, didn't really exist before the 1980s. This is the second mortgage, basically. You know, the loan you take against the equity accrued in your house. Because of a 1986 tax law, this suddenly became a profitable thing because the tax law removed other forms of credit for tax deduction, but said that only the primary mortgage and a home equity loan, a secondary mortgage, would be tax deductible. The banks rushed into this, and by the 1990s, home equity loans had become what one consumer activist called a gigantic credit card. You had these home equity loans of credit that if you had a certain amount of credit in your equity in your house, you could get an open line of credit that was just like a credit card. You wrote a check against it, used your credit card against it. It could be 110% of the presumed equity in your house. Then, of course, 2008 happened, the housing prices melted down, all that equity disappeared, and lots of people are in a lot of trouble now. Can't move from their houses because the second they move, they got to pay back these enormous home equity loans. But this too stoked enormous amount of consumption. Mortgages, I think we know more about: seductive mortgages, no down payment, teaser rates, and then, of course, the infamous subprime mortgages targeted on lower income households, you know, particularly from the late 1990s to the housing crisis. We should say at the same time that when all this was happening, there were lots of the rosy reports about the globalization of credit in the world, that everybody was going to become like us, everybody was going to have their credit card, everybody was going to take out home equity loans. Well, it did happen in much of the English-speaking world, but it didn't happen that much in the rest of the world. There was a lot of pushback against this credit revolution. It's interesting that in Japan, continental Europe, it's actually very rare that somebody either has a revolving credit card, that is a credit card you don't have to pay back in full, or uses their credit card to borrow. In Japan, they've been available, a revolving credit card, since the early 1990s, but almost nobody actually borrows against it. They pay them in full. Places like Germany, it's actually very hard to find a real credit card. They're tied to your bank account, and you pay them back in full at the end of a 30-day period. Home equity loans, the same. Very hard to find home equity loans in a lot of the major economies in continental Europe or in Japan. And also, particularly in Europe, very aggressive policies in the last 15 years to combat what is called over-indebtedness, a concept that doesn't even exist in the United States. But these are legal categories in Europe. You get over-indebted, you don't pay back part of a bill for 90 days in Belgium, your name gets reported to the Central Bank of Belgium, social workers are sent out to your house, and you are straightened out. It's very, very interventionist, very paternalistic. Well, And I should say, finally, as all of this expansion of credit was occurring, it was occurring against the backdrop of growing income inequality in the United States. Real wages were falling, or at least stagnating, for as much as 90% of the American households by the 2000s. So this is when credit was exploding in the United States. So if you want to put it in shorthand, in Europe, when you get in trouble, you get social benefits from the government. In the United States, when you get in trouble, we extend you more credit. Okay, and that has been the story. Well, let's move on to the conclusions. The book, unusual for a historian, but I spent a few months in Washington, so I was told I had to do policy recommendations, and I really got into it. So the book ends with policy recommendations, which I like, and I'll see what you think of them. But I'm not going to go through every one. Most of them sum up into more financial inclusion. We have such a high percentage of our populace, particularly lower income households, who are unbanked or underbanked. They don't have bank accounts. They end up wasting a lot of cash. They also have to go to payday lenders and the alternative financial services. We need to, as a society and a government, I think, do a lot more toward financial inclusion, doing some of the things that are done in France and Germany, or as in Japan, postal savings, which we could revive, which would actually be very useful both for small savers and for our post office, which is about to disappear. It actually can be very profitable to engage in financial services. And then I'll just end by talking about maybe the one that concerns you most, but we have to change our tax laws. Right now, they don't incentivize saving except for affluent people saving for their retirement, nobody else. And they do encourage an excessive investment in housing, and something I'm sure that's on all of your minds. Well, we Americans, because we're Americans, we like to ignore the world as much as we can and not think about best practices, but there are a lot of best practices out there, and this may be the time to pay attention. Thank you very much.